So here's my very silly, inane example of a sort of 101 guide to what a CRM actually is. So this is me. I have a nickname of Chris Chinchilla. That is actually a chinchilla. And if you're from Latin America, I know it actually should be chinchilla. And I've only been told that by one Mexican, and everyone's been pronouncing it wrong the entire time. But anyway, that's me. This is my wife. And we have a relationship. We are married, of course, but there could be other things there. So there are two people, two contacts with a relationship between each other. We also have Pablo, a cat, a very old cat. And he recently travelled all the way from Australia to Germany, and he's 17, so it's pretty incredible. Anyway,
wow.
That's
awesome.
Yeah. And we have a relationship with him as well. So we have a three-way relationship going on there, and the relationship types between us are different, obviously. I'm not married to my cat, sort of, not quite, but anyway. But as well as those relationships, we have interactions with each other. So Kate will often feed Pablo, and that's an action between the two of them. And often Pablo will sleep. He is 17. And that's an action he just does on his own, really. There's no interaction with anybody else there, apart from trying to get him out the way. That's a very simple, silly example of what a CRM basically is. So you're managing relationships between people and interactions between people. And they can be very simple or very complex. And it's a popular space. There's lots and lots of CRM tools for sales, for non-profits, for everything in between. It's a fairly big market and probably a growing market. And a lot of the old players are also being usurped by startups as well now. So what is CiviCRM? It's an open source CRM. It's primarily aimed at non-profits, but that's not the only place I've seen it used. One of the last jobs I actually had was using it in a magazine. So it's actually being used in a lot of other places. It's open source. It's very suited to the audiences it's aimed at, because often they're community organizations and they like the whole way that it's a community project as well. It has a very similar ethic to Drupal. A lot of the people involved in CiviCRM have been involved in Drupal before and things like that. There's a lot of sort of crossover between the two ethos and ethics. It's been around for a few years. Team dotted around. The sort of two founders are down in the Bay Area, but there's sort of committers, core team all around the world. Yeah, that's a sort of introduction to it. Here's some of its features. This is not actually going to be a talk through the features of CiviCRM, because I always run out of time. It has so many features, and it's not actually really that interesting, and you could find that out yourself. This is more about how to get it to work well with Drupal, really. But just as a very quick overview, at a basic contact management, that's something you couldn't have a CRM without contact management, organizing people into groups, dynamic groups, like smart groups based on certain parameters, etc., and then the relationships between them, of course. Contribution management, donations, memberships, event money, etc. Events management, so running booking for events and mailing lists, reminders of events, collecting demographic information, dietary requirements, name badges, etc. Bulk mails, a bulk mail service with marketing information as well, reports, campaigns, and much more. It's a very feature-rich tool, which I'll sort of come back to in a minute. Now, before we go any further, though, we should say what CiviCRM isn't. It is not a Drupal module. Now, this is actually possibly one of the biggest problems many Drupal people have with Civi, is that it's not a proper module, and it isn't. And to be blunt, I think they've actually taken themselves off the Drupal module page, and it's probably the best thing they ever did, because as soon as you download it, you realize it is not a Drupal module. It is not a normal Drupal module by any means. It's best to think of it as any other CRM tool, like Salesforce or Blackboard and things like that. Consider it an external service that just happens to integrate with Drupal quite well. But consider it an external service, and then you stop getting so annoyed with it because you stop thinking of it as purely a Drupal module. And some of the reasons for that is it actually integrates with WordPress and Joomla as well. So sort of 90% of the code is common, and then there's integration modules for the various CMSs. And that's worked quite well for them. They've actually, Civi has had a massive growth in the WordPress community, which sort of helped its numbers generally. That said, a lot of the integration options we're going to talk about are Drupal modules, and you will find them on Drupal.org. So bearing all that in mind, why use it? If it's not a proper Drupal module, and there are things like Red Hen, which are proper Drupal modules, why use it? Well, I guess from my perspective, I would say it's a very complex system. Any sort of CRM tool is going to be complex by virtue of what it is. But I have found with a lot of the sort of more complex Drupal modules, things like Commerce and Red Hen, they're often giving you a tool to create your own functionality for a client, which is great if you're a developer, but sometimes you'd actually just like something you can install, turn on, and it kind of gives you some features straight away. And that's one of the things Civi is good at. If you're happy just to stick with its sort of default feature set, you can kind of run the installer, turn it on, and you get hundreds of features just straight away. And that is a good thing. And it is, in contrary to, despite it not being Drupal native, it's probably still the most popular Drupal CRM because it just has been around a bit longer. And whilst it's a very small development community, has a more and faster development cycle than the other options as well. So, you know, but you are in a Civi talk, so I'm going to be slightly biased, of course. So, so the overview of this session is it's going to be a slightly developer-focused talk, but nothing particularly complex. We're going to have a little look at how its code base is actually structured and understanding how it's put together. And we'll look at the existing Drupal integration that is there. We'll then look at how, so, you know, I always say this, content management is quite simple, really. CRM tools are actually incredibly complex. You're trying to represent business processes and workflows, which are actually quite complicated. So, as you would expect, an off-the-shelf system is not going to do or match the requirements for everybody. And the biggest problem I always have with clients is people who expect that. To expect that a system that has been downloaded thousands of times is going to suit everybody out the box. I mean, it's not going to happen. So we're going to look at the bottom three ways, sort of how we can customize it within a Drupal context and also in a Civi context. And the three main ways we'll look at are overrides, creating a Drupal module, and then creating a CVCRM extension. And a lot of the principles are the same. So, first up, it's code base. This is more spaghetti. CiviCRM's code is a little bit of a mess, and I will be happy to admit that. It's going through a bit of a restructure at the moment, and we'll see where that goes. Within the sort of next 6 months, it's sort of going through almost a Drupal 8 type process at the moment. We'll see where it goes. It's quite big because of that. The Civi module is actually bigger than Drupal, which is quite crazy. It's sort of PHP, MVC, so models, view controller, framework-ish, object-oriented. So the interesting thing is if you've been doing Civi work, Drupal 8 doesn't seem that scary because it's actually using a lot of those concepts already, object-orientedness, proper templating engine, things like that. It uses for its templating something called Smarty, which is an older equivalent to Twig, which is in Drupal 8. And because of that as well, it probably actually means it will be the first CRM that will be Drupal 8 ready, because it's actually a simpler job to make it ready. So it helps. But it is a slightly messy code base, and we will sort of encounter the rough structure of it as we go. But if you've done any framework-based PHP, like Cake or Symfony even, it's actually not too you'll probably get on better with it than Drupal, so in some respects. So what is the existing Drupal love? There's actually quite a bit, and we'll have a look at an example of some of these. Views out the box, so you can expose lots of the Civi data objects in views really easily, and that is extremely powerful. Ways of visualizing Civi data in Joomla and WordPress suck, really. It's really hard to get it looking good. The fact that you can integrate with views and you can just do everything rendered in a Drupal way is actually really good, and that includes exposed filters, filtering, sorting, any of the kind of views plugins for rendering in different formats and things like that will all then layer on top of it. So that's extremely powerful and useful. Rules as well, commerce and Ubercart, so you can record sales and things like that against a CRM record. Web form, again, Civi will often append its own sort of URLs for registration forms and things like that, and they're not terribly sort of SEO friendly URLs. So the ability now to be able to plug in with web form and use web form to render those forms and process those forms, and that integration module has come on in leaps and bounds as well, and we'll have a quick look at it. That's another really powerful thing. Installation profiles. So this is a slightly more advanced Drupal topic, but you can create Drupal distributions of sort of pre-packaged modules and customizations, and there is a CVCRM starter kit, which is a distribution that has been kind of put out the box to install with Drupal a lot easier and run with Drupal a lot easier. Because of that, there's a lot of good Drush integration as well. So if you're a Drush fan, you can do a lot of Civi functionality with Drush as well, clearing caches, backups, updates, things like that. Backup and migrate. Because a lot of these modules, Pantheon, who I just noticed are a sponsor, so I'm giving them a plug, are one of the few Drupal hosting companies that have given some really good thought to Civi hosting as well, and they used a lot of the installation profile, Drush, and backup and migrate integrations to make Civi Drupal sites work really well on their hosting. The magazine I worked for, we used Pantheon for that, and we had quite high traffic, and often we would launch.
It requires a virtual server, correct? I mean, I'm sorry, a dedicated server.
Pantheon?
No. CiviCRM.
Oh, okay, I'll come to that in a sec, yeah. Okay, I'll come to that in a sec. We would have, we launched a new newspaper at one point, and we were taking a lot of subscriptions, and they coped with that very, very well. We didn't lose a single transaction, there were no clashes or things like that. And again, cron modules, cache modules, features as well. If you're a fan of features, there is the beginnings of a CiviCRM features integration module. It works to a point, but the fact that someone's even managed to do it is quite good. On the quick subject of hosting, Civi is quite memory intensive. You could get away with it on sort of shared hosting, but wouldn't recommend it. It will slow down a fair bit, and a lot of the code improvements coming will make that a bit better. But also, so Drupal is kind of architected in a fairly lazy way at the moment, but Civi is a bit more specific with its database layer. It uses a lot more MySQL functions that you don't find in Drupal, and sometimes you need permissions and things like that that you don't even get on shared hosting. So you can run it on shared hosting, but I wouldn't recommend it. But even then, like a VPS or something is fine. Just something that gives you a good sort of level of sysadmin type access is probably best. But you could manage it just about. So let's have a look at a couple of these. Now, this is where it's always really annoying because Keynote doesn't mirror. Okay, so I'm going to actually, I may have to switch mirroring on, sorry. This is just, it's very hard to. resolution is not great, so it's going to be a bit squashed. So very quickly, views first. It's not great, is it? So things. So you'll see here, if you're familiar with views at all, you just get a whole bunch of extra Civi data types that can be displayed. Let's go for contacts as a simple example. And you get pretty much what you'd expect. You get a whole bunch of extra fields available, including custom fields you might have created in Civi as well. Pretty much, it handles a lot of the relations as well. So, for example, in the Civi world, a contribution is related to a contact, and it's pulling all the related information to a contact in as well. And these can all be, so you can start to very quickly creating some quite powerful tools that you can't even do in Civi, but with the Drupal integration it gives you that option. So for example, creating something like a very powerful filter by using the exposed filter. Quite quickly you can just make a membership listing page that can be searchable and filterable by a variety of ways on the fly by people. And this also feeds into, you could theoretically, often one of the biggest issues we've had with clients is when they want custom reports. And basically a report is really just how many people match a criteria, but they don't know what they're always going to need. So actually you will give them access to views, which to non-developers is understandable. It's understandable enough that they can create report criteria and things with it to make a report, theoretically. So it's quite a powerful option there. So your usual web form settings are here, but there's a special CiviCRM tab that lets you enable CiviCRM processing, and it does a limited amount of things at the moment, and I'm not entirely sure what version I have of the integration module, but I think by the looks of it, the main restriction used to be that you couldn't take any financial transactions through it. So you could do event registrations, contact forms, things like that, but if you wanted to have like paid event registrations or donations, the integration module wouldn't handle it. But they have added that now. I'm just not entirely sure if I have that version though. But so this is pulling in fields from Civi, tags, groups, address, phones, address things, custom fields, and then they will show up as normal web form fields. So again, you get all the options that web form would accommodate, like select and other. Select or other is a great web form functionality that you then get with the integration, which you wouldn't get with Civi by default. So things like that. And then abilities to sort of change messages and things like that if someone's logged in or not. Create an activity when someone, so Civi has activities like we're talking about with feeding the cat and things like that. Activities get generated against a contact for all sorts of actions, and you can create custom ones here. So yeah, event registrations, membership, contributions, additional options. It's a very, very good integration module, and the guy who works on it, who's an American guy, I'm not sure where he's from, has done a really nice job of making this extremely powerful. I think I'll keep an eye on the time and keep pushing on. So now, we've got Civi installed in Drupal. We want to make some changes. How are some of the ways we can do that? So one of the simplest ways, and I sort of cascade these up from the simplest and the sort of oldest way of doing it to the now preferred way of doing it, but they're all still valid. So initially we have overrides. So as I mentioned, CVCRM is a sort of models views controller type PHP application, which means it's got its logic, its templating, and its sort of data, content, object, all somewhat separated. So we can override the PHP by defining a directory where we put our overrides. We can override the templates by creating a directory. And it might make more sense if I show what that looks like. So for example, I'll very quickly dive into, this is the distribution. I always forget this, the module's in a slightly different place. So this is kind of what the Civi codebase looks like. This is all the PHP logic in this folder, and you can see here we've got a variety of usually objects of some description. Some might seem more obvious than others. And then down here in the templates is a similar sort of affair. So basically, if we, for example, so a common one, I want to override the contribution form. And here we can see some of the various Smarty templates that make up that form. So how I know which one I need, I'll show you in a second. But basically, I would make a copy of this file, and then inside that overrides folder, I'd recreate that exact structure, that folder structure, and create a copy of the file, and then I can edit it and do what I like, and it uses the overridden one. And it's the same principle with the PHP. Now, one quite nice little thing that Civi has to, so you know what one you need, is inside the that's not what I wanted, sorry. Inside. I'll get to the link. It's over there again. Oh, that's a very good point. Why? Why did I not think of that? So inside the problem with me using my kind of test site is I've been doing all sorts of stuff with it. So these bits might be broken. But if you inspect the code, you'll see here, everywhere inside where Civi injects its code, it does this TPL file invoked. So if you ever want to override something and you know, what the hell is it? It actually tells you which one to override. And the PHP file with the logic will be the same, but just .php instead of .tpl. So that's quite useful. Now, that has its limitations because when there's upgrades and things like that, the core code base that you've overridden changes. So you have to be a little bit conscious of that when you're using the overrides. But it's a nice, quick, simple way of just making some simple changes, like I want some slightly different HTML structure around something, or I want to add some extra CSS classes, things like that. It's pretty quick and easy way of doing it without having to know too much of what's going on. So that's the first way. Second way, and some of this is being alluded to in this screenshot already, is creating a Drupal module. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. I'm not going to go and do a coding example live. I'm going to show you through one simple and one more complex example of how we created a Drupal module to override CVCRM functionality or enhance CVCRM functionality. So Drupal has hooks. If you've done any kind of Drupal module creation, you know there's hooks that you use to run certain code when certain things happen or in certain parts of the kind of Drupal process. And Civi is much the same. It also has quite a good API, and I'll show you a really cool tool it has in a minute of how that a cool tool. So this is a module we called. You don't have to call it CiviCRM underscore anything to make it a CiviCRM specific Drupal module. That's just a naming convention we happened to use so we could recognize it was a sort of Civi enhancing Drupal module. And this is a Drupal module.info file. There's nothing in here that is unusual. This is all pretty normal Drupal stuff. possibly we should have a dependency set there of CiviCRM. That's one thing we probably should have in there, but apart from that, everything is pretty normal. And now we go into the actual module code. So if you've done any Drupal modules, a lot of this will seem very familiar. And again, so it's a really good way of you being able to leverage what the CMS does really well and use its functionality for that, and then hand over to Civi for what it does well. So this, for example, was for the magazine. So the new newspaper, people who had picked delivery to their home address. We had to pre-populate their CiviCRM record to show them who their local newsagent who was making that delivery was going to be. So if there was a problem, they could go around the corner and shout at them or ring them up and stuff like that. So what we needed to do was, and it also did a whole bunch of other things, but that's the sort of basic to it. So here we have, this is all Drupal code. There's nothing specific to Civi here. We had a form that people got to see the address we had for them on record. Firstly, say, is this still the right address? And then because the newspaper delivery people wanted the address in a very particular format, which Civi didn't do by default, like it wanted every bit of the address split up, like 123 street type in separate fields into a CSV file, and that was annoying. We had to use an address like aggregator system to take the address, then split it up, and then bring it back to us. So we were using Drupal Form API to give people a form. This is then doing some processing with the file that we got given by the news agency. I mean, none of this is all Drupal stuff so far. Getting to Drupal batch, a whole bunch of things here. Now, so here we have, in this particular case, we had to do some horrible direct database type work for reasons I can't quite remember at this particular moment in time. But we can use Drupal database functions to interact with Civi tables, no problem. So here's where we start to actually have some Civi specific things. So we're using its API here to get a membership that someone has, and then do some processing with it. And here's some of the parameters, and here's the call. So we can see that this is Civi specific because it's prefixed by Civi, but it's sitting very nicely in a Drupal module, and I'll show you the API in a second. And then there's more just fairly normal Drupal and PHP code. Here's another example where Civi has its whole bunch of functions that do all sorts of things, sending emails, formatting addresses, currency formatters, record a transaction, all sorts of things. And sometimes we want to utilize some of its code base as well. And here's how we can do it. The if CVCRM initialize is sort of one of those optional things, but good to do just to check the module is enabled so everything doesn't just break down. And then what it's doing here is calling a function, and this underscoring here is reflective again of that folder structure. So this is actually folder CRM, folder core, folder BAO, folder address, and then a function. And this is what this is doing. So Civi stores all its state and province values as an ID number. An ID number means nothing to a person. And Minnesota is ID 123. Well, I don't know. I live in state 123. What does that mean? So we had to format it back out in a way that people actually understand what it means. So we used a functionality built into Civi to do that. And a lot of the rest of this. So this is predominantly a Drupal module. So here we've used the CVCRM functionality to send an email. So this means all the email settings that have been set up in Civi with its message templates, with the ability to sort of mail merge contact information into that email and record it as an activity against the contact, all gets leveraged by using its functionality instead. We've had to do some requires to access the code, but again, here is some specific CiviCRM code. But it's reasonably self-explanatory, but so it's a Drupal module with a mixture of Drupal code, Civi code, interactions between the two, and again, leveraging the bits of the two systems that are better at what they do. So we use the Drupal Form API because Drupal forms are actually much nicer to look at and style and theme, and then pass the information to Civi. And that's not an uncommon thing to do. A lot of people do find the Civi UI a bit clunky, so often people will use it literally as a backend for information and pass things in through modules and things like that instead. So some of the API functionality, we know we can interact with various CiviCRM objects and call them, create them, edit them, etc. But how do we know what we're looking for? How do we know what code to use and things like that? And it has a very nice tool, and I don't know what they made it in, and Drupal could do with something similar. It has this API Explorer, which works locally on your installation, so you can actually play around with data that's relevant to you. And it lets you firstly pick what you're trying to query and access, and some of these are ones I have never used. I'm going to stick with contacts because it's obvious, we know what a contact is. And what are we trying to do? Are we trying to find some particular contacts? Are we trying to create them, delete them, etc., etc.? So let's say, for example, we're trying to find think of an example now. We're trying to find a particular contact. So it's already, we haven't really set any values yet, but you can already see it spat out boilerplate code for us. And there's several ways to access the Civi API through Smarty templates in a front end, through PHP code, and through JavaScript code for a mixture of the two in an Ajax type way. And also REST queries if you are, I won't explain what REST is. People who know what it is will know that it's useful, and people who don't, well, you may find it useful at some point in the future. And again, if we're not really sure what sorts of fields we're looking for, it's spat out kind of, this is with no parameters, obviously. So if we look, we'll probably find quite a lot of information because there's nothing filtered at the moment. Yeah, so there's quite a lot. But let's say, for example, so yeah, I'm trying to find contact type organization. So we could start playing around. So I have to be careful not to break into British spelling. That's it. And it has filtered the results to just organizations. So we can see our theories and thoughts about how we needed to code this have been confirmed. And now we've been given the PHP code in this example that we actually need. It's given us exactly what we need to paste in to work with. And if we sort of flip back to some of the code examples, you'll see something very similar up here somewhere. There we go. So something very similar. And that's often how I've got that code in the first place. I've played around with the Explorer to find what I need to know. And that's a very cool tool because you can actually play with your data to figure out what it is you're trying to query. Okay. And that module is then put in your Drupal module folder and enabled and et cetera, as normal. Nothing particularly unusual there. The next one is creating a CVCRM extension. And here we divert from the Drupal path slightly. It's CMS agnostic, theoretically, so it should work with Civi if it's installed in WordPress, Joomla, or Drupal, unless you're doing something very Drupal specific, in which case you're probably going to make a Drupal module anyway. So it creates a nice redistributable package. So we saw some of those overrides. Those overrides are great, but say, for example, we're in the open source community, so you've made an override that enhances Civi really nicely, but at the moment it's only in your installation. That's not very shareable. But you can package it up into an extension, and then people can download it and get the same cool functionality. And they're enabled and disabled within Civi itself in very similar ways to a Drupal module. And yeah, the most thing you get is, of course, community love. And it's often, as you will see in the Drupal world, when a client has a particular requirement and you say, how about you sponsor a module? I've had clients that have sponsored extensions as well. And again, it has quite a nice tool that's a bit Drush-like for helping you start these extensions. And I'll show you an example of one. And then I will... So there's a bit more to it. I think the best way to start. So this is an XML file, which is just the information. So this is like the Drupal module.info file. So things like anyone again who's done Java and things like that will recognize that sort of file name convention to identify an extension, descriptions, licenses, contact information, version, sorry, and things like that. And then how and where the actual code you're working on is put varies a little bit on what you're doing. This is a reasonably simple example. This is one for splitting, as it says, splitting addresses into individual components and then validates. So a lot of this code is all boilerplate from the extension. We don't really change very much, but it lets you do things like, what to do to the database when the extension is installed or uninstalled, what happens if it's upgraded or downgraded, etc., etc. If you're installing some custom field types, or when it's uninstalled, you don't want those still in the database, things like that. But here we're using, so this line 83 there, we're using a CiviCRM hook. And these are similar to Drupal hooks, and I'll show you this web page, which I refer to all the time because I can never remember what ones I need. But Civi hooks for interacting with the code flow, basically. So things like CiviCRM post is run after an object is saved into the database. Pre is before it's saved into the database. Form hooks. So when the form is built before it's rendered, when the form is validated. GUI hooks for all sorts of things. I mean, to be honest with you, the ones you mainly use are those database ones, but there's other needs for some of these as well. Email hooks, permissions hooks, and then miscellaneous. And they do all sorts of things, and again, the documentation, it's not as thorough as Drupal documentation because there's less of it, but if you click on one, you'll see a rough explanation of what the function looks like, its parameters and things like that. So what we have here in this example is basically on the build form. So the first part is our extension name, and then after the first underscore, that's the hook. So it's saying, so it's using a bit of Drupal code here. If there is a current user logged in, and the form name is this particular form, then we do a bunch of stuff, basically. And this could have been a Drupal module as well, but it wasn't necessarily doing anything specific to Drupal, so it made more sense to make it a Civi extension. And that divide line is grey, about when one is more appropriate than the other. And there's a bunch of other things happening in there. And the rough sort of structure of one of these is This is a very simple one. That's it, pretty much. To get you started with some of that, there is, I say, this command line tool. So we can see. Now, I have this problem a lot, annoyingly. For some reason, it never saves. There we go. That's what I want. Okay. Right. So this is actually written in Symfony. So if you want to learn a bit of Symfony before diving into Drupal 8, have a look at Civi. Not that it's very relevant, but anyway. So it's a command line tool for doing a bunch of maintenance type stuff, but also here creating, it's not very readable unfortunately, but creating API functions, creating new extensions, and then in your extension, creating, say, an XML file that represents custom fields you might be adding to your extension, creating a new form, creating a new page, creating a new report, and it does a lot of that stuff that developers love of type a command, whoosh, boilerplate code created for me without having to figure it all out. It's quite a useful tool, and a whole bunch of other things in here as well. So I could do a very, very simple example. It's been a little while since I've used it, so I'll have to remember what command I actually need. And I didn't practice this, so maybe as we've got 15 minutes to spare, I won't, just because I might let myself in for trouble there. But yeah, so it's a quite useful little tool to get you started for making extensions. And to be blunt, like most of the extensions I've ever created have not been that complex. I created a payment processor, which is probably the most complex one, but a lot of that was about interacting with the payment processor, and that's where the complexity came, not necessarily the Civi side of things. And these are found in, so you'll find them inside, this is where the menu is so out of whack, I'm trying to figure out what I'm looking for. The one I'm actually looking for seems to have vanished off the side, annoyingly. It doesn't run very well in low resolutions, quite clearly. There we go, that's the URL anyway. So, and they'll show up here and can be enabled and disabled, uninstalled, upgraded if there's an upgrade available. And the theory at the moment is you can go to a web page and download them, but they're also, oops. Also, some of the ones that have been around a bit longer and are sort of more approved by the core Civi team will show up here as well, and you can just sort of browse them in line in your site. But I've got file permissions all over the place. So, so yeah, there's a few. I've created a few of my own here, and there's a couple of others floating around, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was a brief overview of how to kind of get Civi playing nicely with Drupal. It's a little bit of a scary place at times, but if you're interested in getting involved, that's the Civi website. They're on IRC as well, unsurprisingly. The issue queue and the forums are kind of places to go for problems and advice. And conferences and sprints, much like a Drupal community. In fact, there is one in Washington, DC, very soon. I can't remember the exact date, but very soon. So if you're anywhere near Washington, DC, there is a Civi Day happening September, I think. And there's one in London as well, around the same time as DrupalCon Amsterdam. They often time them to match DrupalCons, not WordPress camps or Joomla days, but DrupalCons. So, whilst it's cross-platform, most of the Civi developers are all Drupal people. so yeah. And they have sprints as well. We just had a documentation sprint happen recently, not in a physical place, just online. But, and thanks very much. And I have saved just enough time for any questions. I know I kind of dove straight into the more technical side and didn't really necessarily show you Civi in use, so you may have some questions around that. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So I think we saw kind of customers, clients, however you want to call them, from the Civi side. How does that, I guess I'm confused as to how does that actually tie into like users on your Drupal side?
Okay.
Like, is there any kind of connection?
Yes, there is. So the first rule of thumb is you can have a Civi contact that isn't a user, but every user will have a contact record, and it has what's called a UF match table, where it just matches the contact ID to the user ID, and that's again CMS agnostic. So it uses the same, it uses some abstraction that just handles whatever the three CMSs need and maintains this table. So yeah, because you might be adding contacts, business clients, things like that who don't need a login, but anyone who has a login will get created as a contact automatically, and it'll add fields to the user registration forms and things like that. And then it feeds into permissions as well, and the permissions works really well in Drupal and not so well in especially WordPress, because it doesn't have as advanced concept of permissions. So you'll have Drupal user permissions that give you kind of overarching access. So can a user of this role access contributions? Can a user of this role update groups? And then you, for a more fine-grained, you go into Civi and you can actually specify particular groups or forms they can access. They can get a little complicated sometimes, but you generally sort of start at the top with Drupal to say what's the top level of stuff they can access, and then filter it down further down.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing that I wanted to narrow in on too. Like, for example, we're doing kind of an event that we've got the registration on, working with CiviCRM and that sort of thing, and we'd like to be able to, assign specific permissions to attendees of that event.
So what you would do, so once you get beyond Drupal permissions, it's CVCRM ACL, so access control lists, and it works on groups of people. So you would create a smart group of attendees of the particular event or event type or event types within a certain date or whatever the parameters happen to be, and that group has a name, and then you say that group has access to create, edit, view, delete, whatever it happens to be, the particular object, so the event or the contribution page.
Yeah, but I don't want them to have CiviCRM permissions. I want them to have permissions within Drupal based on their attendance. So, you know what I mean? Like, so we've got Drupal stuff we want them to be able to do.
Yep, okay, so actually,
I thought it was to maybe use organic groups.
no, actually there's a simpler way, and there's two Drupal integration modules that are so kind of stock standard part of the Civi install, I didn't even mention them because I didn't think to, because they're just there by default. So again, what you would do is create a smart group based on their registrations or attendance or whatever it happens to be.
On
CVCRM, yeah. And then there is, and this again is specific to Drupal, there is these two modules. This one is on groups, this one is on membership types. They work in a similar way. So you want this one, and there is so you say, you pick the CiviCRM group, and it will include the smart groups, so event participants, and then you match them to the Drupal role they can have.
So that's using the role system.
Yeah.
We were thinking of using organic groups, I think, just because it gets out of control.
And organic groups is actually another integration I forgot to mention. There is Civi organic groups integration. I just haven't used it much because I often find
maybe the quick and dirty version.
Yeah, this is the quick.
Roles in the past. It's just like
we've
used Drupal for our events registration for like 3 years now. So and we have 3 roles for each conference. It's getting pretty long.
I've never needed to use organic groups. I've always found another way that's simpler, but there is integration. I did one way back in the past, and you get similar things, so you can define what a group is created as a Civi record and what members of the groups are.
Could you just, I know you weren't going to show anything on CiviCRM, could you just show like where you go to set up a smart group?
Yeah. It's
You could just show me the page. And
no,
then I
it's
can, like,
it's
work it out from there.
it's mainly because you go about it in a funny sort of way. You do a search.
Yeah.
So, say for example, we want a smart group
Yeah.
of, let's think of something vaguely. I don't know what data I've got here, so I'll go for a simple one. But it could be fairly complex. If I scroll down, you see all the various options there could be. So we search for our criteria, then we select everybody, and here say new smart group. Give it a name. And that is dynamically updated now. So
And where was that on the advanced search form?
it's so you do a search, and then when you get to the results,
Okay.
you select the results and add them to the smart
Okay.
group.
All right.
But the criteria is always editable here. So
Okay.
that's basically it. So you search for them first, and then you add the results, all the
Right,
results
just saved
to
me
it.
20 hours
Yeah.
of
The
figuring
smart
stuff
groups
out,
is one
so
of my
thank you.
favourite features.
You can build smart groups of other smart groups.
Yeah. Yeah, that's often how I've done like exclusion type stuff. Is
Okay,
yeah.
this 5 minutes just saved me 20 Thank you.
Yay! So yeah, there's the organic groups as well. Forgot to mention that, and that roles sync actually, because that's actually a very important thing to mention. I can't believe I forgot to mention it. So you can set when this matching happens as well. So is it when someone logs in for the first time, when the account is created, things like that. And the membership equivalent of this is very useful as well, because you can use it for selling subscriptions to your site, things like that. So if they're a gold member of the organization, they get access to certain content. And you do that because they have a Civi membership which matches a Drupal role, which then gives them access to Drupal stuff that they didn't have before. So it's actually, I can't believe I forgot to mention this, because it's actually one of the kind of crux points. It was almost too obvious. That was a problem. So, anyway, it did get mentioned, so that's
We'll
okay.
give you a round of applause.
All right, well, thanks very much, and I'll be around until Sunday, so if you want to look any more under the hood at stuff, then just come and grab me. And I'm always happy to bang heads against brick walls about Civi. So, so thanks very much. Have a good day.